Hey Exile, PoE Academy here with an excellent mapper for 3.20 Forbidden Sanction. If you like multiple layers of defense like Grace, Determination, Curses and later also Block and Life Unblock, if you like explosions on the whole screen and also a PoB that takes your hand with leveling trees, skill setups, early mapping setups, default setup and a GG setup, then you've come to the right place. You can find the PoB in the description and also a shopping list in my Discord. Alright, so how does the gameplay look like? If you have 4 stacks of Unleash, you will use it to proc your Blade Vortex, then charge into a pack, and if the pack looks dangerous, you proc Molten Shell in advance too. The pack explodes and rinse and repeat. If you're fighting tougher enemies and before you use the default gear of the PoB, you will apply additional curses with Bane. You might now be asking yourself what this build is good for, and it's a really good mapper for league mechanics like Blight, Expedition, Abysses, Harbinger, Ritual, or really anything within a narrow layout. The build also benefits from more difficult map mods as these increase the density of mob packs within a map. And it's a decent bosser with gear, but don't expect to kill Ubers during league start. You might now be wondering if this build is any good for the new league mechanic as we're almost a melee build, but GGG said that your resolve within the mechanic is impacted less by attacks that you're close to, so we should be fine. Before we go over the core mechanics of the build, let's quickly talk about how the 3.20 patch notes affected it. I know that we lost Malediction, which is unfortunate, but instead we also got a lot more powerful curses, that is Despair and Temporal Chains, and even a Feeble depending on your setup. Overall, I think this results in a buff. Alright, so let's talk about the most important mechanic of the build, which is Poison on hit. You will always be getting 50% chance to poison from the tree, and while leveling and early on you will get another 40% from the poison gem. Later on you will get this 40% from Herald of Agony and the remaining 10% will come from an Ice Fang Orbit Ring or alternatively from the Toxic Strike's Anointment. In my tests 90% chance to poison felt fine, so don't worry if you can't get the last 10% yet. Another important mechanic is the Curse on Hit or Blasphemy setup. While leveling and before the default setup you will apply Temporal Chains via Blasphemy and Despair and Enfeeble with Bane. Once you get your hands on an Impressence, you will apply Temporal Chains and Despair via Blasphemy. The build is somewhat starved on reservation, so it's essential to pick up all the reservation nodes according to the trees, and also Eldritch Battery later on if you have some ES on your gear. The build is also somewhat hungry for strength, because you only get 64 strength by default, but you need 155 strength to be able to wear all your gear. The last important mechanic is skill effect duration. Its main purpose is quality of life, as your Blade Vortex will last longer when using it. And before you get your hands on cluster jewels, you will want to pick up the duration mastery in the center. To level this build, you simply want to follow the skill setups and trees in the PoB, but here's the TLDR. In stage 1, which is Act 1 and also a bit of Act 2, you want to be using Holy Flame Totems and Flame Wall. You use Flame Dash linked to a level 1 Arcane Surge to increase your damage and be mobile, and you want to pick up a Blade Vortex gem and level it to prepare it for the swap at level 45. In stage 2, you are going to swap to Bane linked to Temporal Chains and Despair. You also want to be using Blight and Essence Drain for a single target at this point. Many thanks to Subtractum for providing the strategy. I simply copied it, but it fits perfectly into the build. Stage 3 starts when you reach level 45. It is also perfectly fine to keep on leveling with Bane until level 60 and then make the swap. It might actually be even better, but I wanted to play Poison BV as soon as possible. Level 45 is the magic number because at this point you can allocate all the poison nodes on the tree and swap Blade Vortex linked to chance to poison for a total of 90% chance to poison. You will also be getting access to Unleash at this point, which makes the gem much more enjoyable to play. I found that putting Temporal Chains into a Blasphemy setup is very nice to consistently proc Profane Bloom, and every time you fight against tougher enemies you use your Bane to apply Despair on top of it. Alright, now that we've talked about the leveling progression, let's talk about the gear progression. There are 4 different stages in the PoB: very early mapping, default, and the GG setup. The very early mapping setup is what you will be looking at when you just reach white maps. The focus here is to cap your resistances, get strength on your gear, and maybe start getting some extra spell suppression on the gear. But don't worry too much, the build works out of the box and will still do fine in white maps with the gear you found in the campaign. With the early mapping setup, you will break into yellow maps and maybe even touch red maps. Your focus here should be to obtain useful unique items like Obliteration Wands for your weapon slot, or Icefang Orbit Iron Ring for your ring slot, or even an Sin's Rebirth Split Knight Flask for your flask slot. You also want to reach about 80% spell suppression on top of 10k evasion and 10k armor to make the build feel safe while playing. The next milestone is the default setup, which is enough to clear red maps and also do all the regular bosses in the game. Unfortunately, this is the only part where the build progression is not as smooth as otherwise, because you need the Impressence Amulet and also some Cluster Jewels to be able to make the skill gem swap. At this point I also recommend swapping to a Cold Iron Point Dagger, as it increases your damage quite significantly. Another setup you want to be working on is Skin of the Lords, which grants glancing blows, a shield with life gained on hit, and a Rumi's Concoction Flask. Trust me, this setup is insane, as it makes you almost immortal during mapping. 2 Circle of Nostalgia rings, both with increased chaos damage and Herald of Agony buff effect, will make your damage even better, and they also provide a lot of attributes, which is quite handy for the build. Last but not least, there is the GG setup. I only included this because I wanted to show you a way on how you can min-max the build, but yeah, if you made it this far, you probably know what you're doing. So that's it for my starter for 3.20. If you have any questions or improvements, please let me know in the comments, and I also will be adding frequently asked questions to the POB so that everyone can benefit from them. Remember to check out the chopping list in my Discord, and see you in the next one.